right, welcome back to the second session. So we're going to change things up a little bit here. So we had our keynote speaker for the first session. We're going to have a panel presentation. Our panelists will speak to us on the role of gratitude in creativity, art, and scientific exploration, as well as sort of allied areas. And the way this is going to work, our panelists are going to each speak for about 10 minutes each, and then we should have plenty of time for conversation after that. Our three speakers this morning, first we're going to have Dan Kuebler, who is professor of biology here at the Franciscan University of Steubenville. And then we'll hear from Christopher Haley of the Hildebrand Project, and then finally John Henry Crosby, president of the Hildebrand Project. And I was reminded of one of his other titles yesterday of he's a cultural entrepreneur, which I think is the coolest title.
I think I drew the short straw, or the long straw, and got to go first here on the panel. As a scientist, it's my pleasure to be here. I get to do a lot of science and faith talks around the country and work with a lot of philosophers, and I really enjoy conversations with philosophers. I always come away learning something, and so I'm really grateful for John Henry for inviting me to comment a little bit today about the question he posed to me to sort of focus on is how much is science, modern science, driven by a technological posture versus a sort of a disinterested, sort of genuine receptivity to nature. And this dichotomy, I think, is not, I think, the best way to look at the question. I think that's probably most relevant to the conference, which is, I think it's better to say, to what extent is science motivated by a sense of gratitude for creation, and an openness and desire to learn about the natural world, rather than trying to make a distinction between science for utility and science for its own sake, because I think in the lives of most scientists, those two things overlap a lot. I just think my PhD advisor, I worked on bacteria viruses, which you'd think would have zero utility, and he's used that knowledge to develop vaccines, very interestingly enough. And these things go together, but I think what really matters from the perspective of this conference is the attitude scientists has towards nature and the natural world, and that sense of gratitude, nature as a gift versus nature as something that's infinitely malleable, that is a tool for me to use, right? I think a lot of people think modern science is mainly a utilitarian enterprise. And if you look at the number of patents that come out of universities, the amount of money that goes into science, there is a good deal of utility there. But if you, I think, look deeper at the individual scientists and what they are doing, I think you see a more distinct dichotomy between the attitudes that scientists have towards nature. And again, it's not a black or white, but there's a spectrum. But what I want to do to sort of illustrate this is use two historical examples of scientists, three if I have time, probably not, but we'll go with two. And to illustrate, I think, this genuine receptivity and openness to nature versus the limits or the problems inherent in those who look at nature as something infinitely malleable, and how that actually disrupts the progress of science. Okay? So, I think if I were to do my career again, I probably be a scientist again, but if I didn't, I would be a historian of science. I think I'm very fascinated by it. I think, looking at the history of science, you come away with two things. One, the deep synergy between a Christian worldview and the goals of the scientific program, and two, the humanness of science, and that science is littered with all the vices and virtues, and it's not this dispassionate, objective pursuit that many people think it is. So I'm going to use two scientists. One you're probably familiar with as sort of exemplars of these two extremes. And the first is Gregor Mendel. All right, and if you most of you are probably familiar with Mendel and his work, an Austrian monk in the 19th century. But if you think about what was going on in his life at the time that he sort of discovered or was able to parse out the laws of genetics, he spent about 8 years doing his sort of famous work with pea plants, right? And during that time, he was actually, his main job was not as a professor at a university. He wasn't, part of a startup company. He was teaching at a secondary school, right? And this was sort of his side hobby that he was doing. So it was very much just sort of this dispassionate sort of interest in nature. And he spent, these 8 years doing this work, and so he did all these crosses. He did over 25,000 crosses of these pea plants, right? So this is very meticulous work. It's like a grad student when you get chained to the bench and you just keep working, and you get no pay. But he was doing this out of sort of a love for nature, right? And a love to extract, what is it that determined inheritance? Was it, at the time everybody thought it was blending, that if you took a tall pea plant and a small one, they'd end up, you get something in the middle. But in fact, there's just discrete units that eventually became termed genes. But I think in Mendel's life, he published the work. It wasn't widely known until after his death, and wasn't. So Mendel published it, I think, in 1870, and it never became widely known until 1900 when people rediscovered his work. He wasn't too sure about, he had no ego associated with his work. He wasn't sure how generally applicable it was. And right after he published, he became abbot and spent most of his time doing other things. But this sort of genuine receptivity to nature and this patient observation and experimentation of what the natural world was going to reveal to him. Now, in contrast to that, the second scientist, or I would say pseudoscientist, that I want to discuss, and it's interesting because, as Dr. Stanford talked about Marxism, this is a Soviet scientist, Lysenko, Trofim Lysenko. So you may or may not be familiar with him. He was He lived. He died in 1975, but he was the head of agriculture in the Soviet Union during the 1930s, 1940s, and so forth. So Lysenko was a Marxist, and instead of having this sort of receptivity of what does nature reveal to me, implanted on nature his own views. Right. So he rejected Mendelian genetics. Not because he had scientific reasons to do that, but because it didn't fit with sort of this Marxist ideology that nature is inherently pliable. I can make it whatever I want. So he thought that that the natural world could be subjected to his demands, the demands of the Marxists. The idea that you put people in a certain environment, you can change the way they act and change the nature of man. Lysenko thought that he was Lamarckian in his view, that he thought that the natural, like plants, for example, were extremely pliable and would adapt to whatever conditions you put them in. And so he's responsible for millions of deaths because his work didn't correspond with the reality of nature, and so you couldn't grow as many crops based on what he did. One example of what he did is he took wheat and thought, well, we need more wheat. If we put the wheat and plant it really close together, they'll adapt immediately to that and we'll be able to grow more wheat. And of course it didn't work. And so you have the famines that ensued. And so you could see he was bringing this idea that nature will bend to my ideology. And what that did, it not only did it kill millions of people, but it stopped the progress of at least genetics in the Soviet Union. He had many Mendelian geneticists put in jail. So, and so you have this, science is no longer seen, is no longer able to to proceed because of the underlying assumptions that he had about nature. So you have sort of this dichotomy. You have on one hand, Mendel, who was extremely receptive and saw nature, I think, as a gift. This is a gift that I have gratitude for, that I want to understand, that I want to know, I want to learn. I'm open to what nature tells me, versus I have an idea, nature is going to respond to my idea, right? And I can fix nature to meet my own demands. And I think it's interesting that, one is from a Christian worldview and one is from an atheistic worldview. And I think that's not by accident, right? But that doesn't mean that just because you're Christian that you are going to approach nature as a sense of gratitude and gift. And I think there's many examples of Christians that did not do that. Often, though, I think that it's more personal than that. It's not because they have some Marxist ideology, but it's because of money, ego, stature, all those human concerns. And Galileo would be a great example of this. He was, an egotistical SOB for the most part, if you read some of his stuff. And that actually inhibited his ability to understand nature. His understanding of comets, for example, are farcical. And he thought they were just sort of like gas vapors that escaped. They weren't actual real things. And the reason is because he was unable to observe the comets, some really important comets during his lifespan, because he was sick and bedridden at the time. And the people that did publish about them and said, no, they're real meteorological events, he hated them. He didn't want them to take credit for it. So he just went off on them and basically came up with this crazy, well, it wasn't crazy. There's other people who thought, but it made no sense in terms of the data that was out there. So if you're actually going to read from nature, there's no way you would come up with the idea that they're just sort of gases escaping from the earth. So there's many cases, I think, that you see that lack of sort of that receptivity to nature will not only lead you down the wrong path, but inhibit science. I think Galileo, had he had a different attitude, would not have run into as many problems as he ran into, and also would have helped develop science in a much more fruitful way during his lifespan. I mean, he was brilliant and he did a great work, but I think that he limited himself because of his attitude towards nature, and that he wanted to subjugate it to his own ego in a great extent. And I think the underlying attitude that I think that makes for a good scientist, right? And this is something that I've seen in all the exemplars in my life in science, is those people that have a sense of wonder and awe, right, of what they are looking at and what they are seeing, from a cell to a gene to an ecosystem. That sense that there's something greater in nature than me, right? And largely, I think that it resonates with a Christian worldview, that nature is a gift. And if nature is a gift, then there must be a gift giver, right? There's an intelligence behind nature. There's somebody behind nature, rather than nature just being a thing. It just exists, and it exists as a tool. So I really, that is sort of the two extremes. I think most scientists live somewhere in the middle of that. But I think I'll end there, and we'll
Thank you.
move down the line here.
Thank you, Dan.
So I have been told by some people here that they would be disappointed if I did not talk about Rilke. It's really a silly thing to worry about. Those of you who know me know I never don't talk about Rilke. But today I'm not going to talk about a Rilke poem. I actually want to talk about Rilke the poet and what it meant for him to be a poet. You see, for Rilke, a poet was not simply one who writes poetry. It's rather the other way around. In order to write poetry, one first has to be a poet. And what did it take to be a poet? In his letters to a young Russian poet, I forget if it was Boris Pasternak or Maria Tsetsevna, one of them asks him this question directly: how do you be a poet? And Rilke answers, you must pay attention. You must watch a single flower bloom. In another letter, he describes his poetic mode as a divine seeing into the heart of things. It's this attitude of paying attention to things and to the heart of things that I want to talk about. For poetry is a sort of heightened paying attention for all of us, a shared communal paying attention. Art uniquely gives us this special way of paying attention and of sharing and communicating attention. Man dwells poetically, Hildebrand says. And he tells us again that poets establish what remain in the poem, sometimes called Remembrance, sometimes called Souvenir. The German title is Andenken, to think about. This thinking about is an important, indeed an essential aspect of gratitude. Baldwin Schwartz, a student of Hildebrand's, in his essay on gratitude, and I'm cheating here a little bit because we haven't published this yet, but we will soon. He says that he calls our attention to the French word for gratitude. He writes, this is Schwartz, that the feeling of gratitude is based on a cognitive element, as this character of a response is apparent in the French expression for gratitude, pardon my French, être reconnaissant, related to the word for recognition. I can be grateful, he says, only where I recognize or think that I do, that what I experienced was a good for me. The response of gratitude is distinct from, additional to, though intertwined with, that of joy. You might very well experience joy at a sunset, at beholding a bowl of roses, or when someone does some kindness for you. But it's the recognition that this was not just joyful, but this was a good for me that invites forth this response of gratitude. You stop and behold the beautiful view, a bird in flight, maybe a windhover, or a kingfisher catch fire. We've all known such moments, and they are marked by a special quality of being good for me. Dana Gioia calls these arresting moments, right? Like Peter says at the Transfiguration, Lord, it is good that we are here. What a marvelous response. You don't simply enjoy the good, the sunset, the bird in flight, even indeed the Transfiguration, but you recognize that this is good for me. And not only is it good for me, but it didn't need to happen to me. I could have missed the sunset or the flower. I have missed many. This beauty, just like an act of charity, is not owed to us. Nowhere is this expressed better than in the poem by Robinson Jeffers, The Excesses of God, which I will read. It is not by his high superfluousness we know our God. For to be equal to a need is natural, animal, mineral, but to fling rainbows over the rain, and beauty above the moon, and secret rainbows on the domes of deep sea shells, and make the necessary embrace of breeding beautiful also as fire, not even the weeds to multiply without blossom, nor the birds without music. There is the great humanness at the heart of things, the extravagant kindness, the fountain humanity can understand, and would flow likewise if power and desire were perchmates. You see again in the Jeffers poem this Rilkean heart of things. The world could get along just fine without rainbows. There's really no need at all for the moon to be beautiful. And why the heck are there all these gorgeous colors on the insides of seashells? Who needs all that? No one. But in discovering these things, it is we who discover them. They are a joy for us. They are a good for us. At the heart of things, of creation, if we pay attention, if we recognize it, there is beauty everywhere that speaks to us precisely in our humanity, in our creatureliness. And this beauty is a gift. Later in Schwartz's essay, he says that we are grateful for gifts precisely because we know they are gratuitous, that we cannot claim them, that they are freely given. He writes, there is a deep correspondence between the joy and the event, but there is another quality intermingled with the joy. They feel an impulse to do something, an obligation, an impulse to give thanks. There is no human being to whom they can turn, because no one has done this for them. Even there, or even where there is someone who has been instrumental, they will still feel that their obligation has not been fulfilled. When they have thanked this person, people who usually do not think of God do, nevertheless, in such moments, turn to God to thank him. Chesterton, in his book on St. Francis, writes, this is Schwartz quoting Chesterton, Rossetti, quoting Rossetti, makes the remark somewhere, bitterly, but with great truth, that the worst moment for the atheist is when he is really thankful and has nobody to thank. Having myself been an atheist, I can aver that this is true. It was beauty more than anything else that led me to Christ. And a critical crisis in that movement was the crisis of an appropriate response to beauty. I knew it was necessary to give thanks, but how? To whom? Was I going to be a pagan and worship rivers? There was something really inadequate about the impersonal desire to give thanks. We all know the lovely line from Cardinal Ratzinger. The only really effective apologia for Christianity comes down to two arguments, namely the saints the church has produced and the art which has grown in her womb. But why are these so effective? I could give many reasons. Indeed, that's a whole other seminar. But one reason, one part of the apologia is the gift quality, the gratuitousness of the beauty and holiness. This was a realization that Max Scheler led Hildebrand to regarding St. Francis. St. Francis was not just a good or even a great man, but there was something here that was more than morality. And this is the realization we have when we see the beauty at the heart of things. It is more than mere nature, or, as in the Jeffers poem, more than to meet a need. There is a great humanness at the heart of things. That is one way that gratitude relates to art and poetry, as a fully aware, attentive response to the gratuitous beauty in creation that is good for all of us. But there's more. I quoted earlier from Hölderlin, the poets establish what remain. Much can be said about this line, and indeed Heidegger wrote a whole book on it, as Heidegger does. But despite Heidegger's calling himself a poet, I don't think he is one. So we'll turn to a real poet, Keats. We all know the Keats line also, that beauty is truth, truth beauty, that is all you know on earth and all you need to know. Which would be a fine place to stop if I'm out of time, but okay. It's hard to continue after that line, but we'll try. Another Keats poem I want to talk about is the poem Endymion, which I will also read. A thing of beauty is a joy forever. Its loveliness increases. It will never pass into nothingness. But still we keep a bower quiet for us, and a sleep full of sweet dreams, and health and quiet breathing. Therefore, on every morrow, we are wreathing a flowery band to bind us to the earth, spite of despondence, of the inhuman dearth of noble natures, of the gloomy days, of all the unhealthy and o'erdarkened ways made for our searching. Yes, in spite of all, some shape of beauty moves away the pall from our dark spirits. Such the sun, the moon, trees old and young, sprouting a shady boon for simple sheep. And such are daffodils with the green world they live in, and clear rills that for themselves a cooling covert make against the hot season, the mid-forest break, rich with the sprinkling of fair musk-rose blooms. And such, too, is the grandeur of the dooms we have imagined for the mighty dead, an endless fountain of immortal drink, pouring unto us from heaven's brink. So yes, it is about Endymion, the sleeping god, but more so, this is about beauty, the endless fountain of immortal drink pouring unto us from heaven's brink. The opening line well describes, I think, the role of art in gratitude. A thing of beauty is a joy forever. Its loveliness increases. It will never pass away. The poets establish what remains. In creating works of beauty, the poets give to all of us a gift. We don't deserve the works of Keats, Dante, Rilke, Shakespeare. The list goes on, and certainly includes painters, sculptors, and composers too. We don't deserve them any more than we deserve the technicolor insides of seashells. But we are given these things. They are for us, and they are good for us. They call forth not only awe, reverence, respect, but gratitude. And here I want to turn to one of my favorite passages in Hildebrand's essay on gratitude, where he talks about the third type of gratitude, he says, namely, the relationships in which the grateful upward glance of one person to another is an element constitutive of the relationship. I love this observation. It's so quintessentially Hildebrandian, to notice and to articulate, even in this long, awkward phrase, the gratitude of the grateful upward glance of one person to another. When you hear it, though, you know you've experienced it, right? The sort of gratitude that Hildebrand is talking about here has more to do with the gratitude of a student to a mentor or an apprentice to a master, more like what John Henry is going to talk about, I think. That is indeed a special type of relationship that engenders a special type of gratitude. But I would like to extend this idea. We'll see what John Crosby thinks about my attempt here, because I think it applies even more broadly, that it applies even across centuries. When we recognize the great gift that the poets have given us, and especially when we feel that we have some relationship, some sort of communion with the artist, like a Rilke, a Beethoven, a Michelangelo, we are and ought to be grateful. And we cannot be grateful to a poem, to a symphony or a sculpture, any more than we can be grateful to the flower. That's the crisis for the atheist. No, we can only be grateful to persons. So I am grateful to Rilke, and I have a relationship. We feel this relationship. Often we think we have a sort of kinship or friendship with our favorite artists, poets, whatnot. I'm grateful to Rilke for the poems because they have been an undeserved good for me. And we are grateful to God for making such a world of seashells and symphonies, of rainbows and Rilke. We are grateful for what Hildebrand calls the Magnolia Day, the good gifts of God. Art, poetry, beauty, in a special way, are among the greatest good gifts of God. And they give us a special way into that gratitude. They call it forth, demand it. For this we should give thanks. As the great Polish poet and the good friend of John Paul II, Czesław Miłosz, said, he was thankful, so he could not not believe in God. And perhaps the finest and final for this talk, expression of this gratitude. Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of couple color as a brinded cow, for rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim, fresh fire coal, chestnut falls, finches' wings, landscape plotted and pierced, fold, fallow, and plow, and all trades their gear and tackle and trim, all things counter, original, spare, strange, whatever is fickle, freckled, who knows how, with swift, slow, sweet, sour, a dazzle dim, he fathers forth, whose beauty is past change. Praise him. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, Christopher, and that is a quite a wonderful setup for what I'd like to talk about. And you stole a little bit of my thunder with the use of the Hildebrand essay, because I'd like to comment also on this this third type of gratitude that von Hildebrand explores. But I'm going to speak perhaps more about the role of gratitude between artists, and also the role of gratitude on the part of particularly the performing artist, the artist who receives the works that are given to the musician, the actor. They are the material with which they bring beauty into the world. Let me begin by reading this wonderful quotation that von Hildebrand often quotes from Kierkegaard about Mozart. And perhaps some of you have heard it before, but it goes as follows. Kierkegaard says, "You immortal one, to whom I owe everything, to whom I owe the loss of my understanding, that my soul was stirred up and my innermost being was shaken, to whom I owe my not having to walk through life as one who is incapable of being deeply moved, you whom I thank for not having to die without having loved." Now, one of the things that I love about this passage, and when I read it to people, I think there's something arresting about it, because I think many people find it stunning that that one would relate to a work of art in this way. And it already suggests something about what art in its highest form can be. This is far away from many more contemporary naturalistic expressions of art, or conceptions of art, in which art is primarily a mode of self-expression on the part of the artist. Art, obviously here, the art of Mozart that has been given to Kierkegaard is this extraordinary gift in the life of Kierkegaard, a source of consolation, a source of awakenedness, was, as Christopher describes, a source of paying attention to things, a source of revelation of things that are perhaps outside of our range of experience. So I think that the Kierkegaard passage I would suggest to you is in a way emblematic of the impact that great art has on us. And I think it's a kind of witness in a world in which art is so often sort of seen through other lenses. One that Hildebrand often identifies is that of aestheticism. And aestheticism can look very much like art appreciation because it can be very refined, very sophisticated. Generally, the aesthete knows more about the fine points of a Beethoven quartet or a Rilke poem. They know the whole surrounding history. But Van Hildebrand would say they may not even experience its beauty because there's a preoccupation with the very refined kinds of pleasure that come from the appreciation of the work. And so what you have in Kierkegaard is this kind of wonderful antidote to this aestheticist way of relating to great works, and on the contrary, he gives us a vision of art that is transformative in life, that is something without which we cannot live. And in Kierkegaard's case, there's clearly a respect in which Kierkegaard wants to say, without what Mozart has revealed to me, without what he has given to me, I would be wandering in life, never having been moved, never having been shattered, never having loved. And as Mozart lovers, Christopher and I would say there is not a bit of overstatement in what Kierkegaard has to say. So I'd like to unpack a little bit more this passage that Christopher had already quoted on this third type of gratitude, the grateful upward glance of one person to another. And the sentence in the Hildebrand essay goes on, in which this grateful upward glance is constitutive to the relationship. And that's quite striking. It's not just gratitude in these cases is not just a kind of attitude that responds to the superabundant, the aspect of that which was not necessary but has been given to me, but it's woven into the very relationship between the giver and the receiver in this case. And I think that one arena, I mean, of course, we can think of this in many perhaps more obvious arenas. We think of a mentor, a great professor, a great teacher. Who is this to us? Someone who perhaps is our model in the journey to our Christian conversion. There are many respects in which we receive, also from a wonderful parent, a noble friend. But I want to read it in light of the kind of reception that happens between artists and use it to unpack what this is. So Van Hildebrand wants to say, first of all, that in this relationship it's constitutive because in the relationship in which this occurs, for example, between a master and a student, the whole relationship is formed first and foremost by the relationship of being a student, coming to a master to learn. And it's in no way demeaning, it's in no way demoralizing, it's an entirely proper relationship because of the gift that is received. But Van Hildebrand goes on to say that there's a kind of complete mutuality in this gift, and that by virtue of, so for example, he says, what a gift is the blossoming of the soul of the beloved person, the bearing of fruit of all that the giver by God's grace can disclose and impart to him. And so I think that in all of the arenas where this occurs, this is true to experience, but this happens in a very particular way in the artistic world. And I think that when it is absent, you have one of the many types of corruptions that can occur in an artistic relationship. So for example, with a great teacher, speaking now, let me switch to speaking a little bit more autobiographically. I was a violinist until carpal tunnel derailed this career of mine. But the relationship that I had to my teacher was a very elevated relationship, and it was very much based in this consciousness of being part of this great tradition. So my teacher in the violin world went all the way back to Paganini. In the world of piano playing, there's no nobler lineage than to be a descendant of the students of Brahms and of Beethoven. And this sense of being, this isn't a point of pride. This is a way of underscoring, perhaps taking a kind of legitimate pride in knowing just how precious it is what I am receiving through this tradition. But already the mutuality is very important, because the student, through the way in which he responds with grace and with gratitude, of course, to the teacher, begins to reflect back the gift that has been given to him. I think as an interesting aside for those of you who are artists or who have activity in the art world, one of the things that has always struck me about an artistic tradition that has a strong element of craft, like in violin playing, we still play wooden boxes that have been somewhat changed, but not that much. The technique has only grown more sophisticated, but it has not been fundamentally changed, and that's received in a very traditional kind of way. And it's interesting to me how this reception and this passing on, in a way you pass on, perhaps always in an enhanced way, but you pass on something fundamental. There is a kind of structure of reception and giving on, a structure of gratitude, but the very fact that you receive something so precious has a kind of conserving effect. You can't go too far off the reservation as a violinist before you just cease to be a violinist, right? If you decide you're going to play it upside down, or you're going to, unless you're trying to show off and play on less strings, if you break a string or something like that. I mean, you can't, do the most fundamental things without without participating in this inherited tradition. And I think this traditional element, particularly in classical music, has had also a somewhat conservative effect on music itself, meaning that there have been certain sort of avant-garde moments, but there's always a kind of return to tonality and harmony and structure, and I think that's closely tied to this weight of tradition. The last thing to say about this, and to sort of bring it back to the theme of gratitude, is that when the musician or the performer in really any artistic venue chooses to abandon this basic posture of being given a precious gift, and when you're entrusted with it, you're entrusted to do very specific things, very particular things, the most obvious of which is to share it with those for whom you perform. This is why communication is at the heart of performance. You're not playing for yourself, you're playing for an audience. But when that structure, when that basic posture of gratitude and humility for what you've been given is maligned or pushed to the side, it very quickly becomes extremely destructive. As a performer, you become vain and conceited, and you lose this ability to communicate with an external audience. The ability to give a gift is somehow subservient to the stroking of one's ego. And in the realm of musical creation and artistic creation, I think something similar happens, where when the gratitude goes away, the reverence for the work goes away, people are very comfortable asserting themselves and inserting themselves into the work. You get this, for example, in opera stagings that are often a basic mockery of the world out of which the opera comes. But because it's a way of being interesting and fascinating and new, it's quite accepted. I have great admiration, I know Christopher does too, for certain musicians who lay down the law and say, we will not participate. And you'd be amazed at how even a conductor of a great world-class opera house at the end of the day is often beholden to what the stage director wants to do. And often it's blasphemous and pornographic, and in every respect a lack of this humility, respect, and gratitude for what has been given. So I think that when I think of an artistic world in which gratitude is not present, I find it difficult not to associate that with some of its most dark and destructive and transgressive kinds of expressions. But when gratitude is present, you have a world in which beauty can be cultivated, a world in which beauty is to build on what Christopher has said, enough. It's not as if, beauty is this sort of boring old thing that we have to make interesting with all of our assertion and all the things that we think we need to do to make it interesting. So it seems to me that an artistic world without gratitude is a very bad place and a very destructive place. And wherever the arts are most thriving, the role of gratitude seems to be a most essential ingredient. Thank you.
Thank you, John Henry, and thank you to all of our speakers. So we have, I think, plenty of time for questions. 25 minutes for questions. Please do raise your hands, and I'm going to usurp the line as chair and ask the first question, as is my wont. So my question is for Dan, and I kind of want to tie your talk about science back to some of the things that John Henry just finished his talk with. So Dan, you talked a lot about this sort of receptivity to nature, right, and gratitude to God through nature, and so forth. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about whether in your work as a scientist and in you're looking at the history of science, you think there's a key place in the sciences, which are not creative in exactly the same sense that art is creative. Is there a place for, or a necessity for, this sort of gratitude to the tradition, right? That is, that you would look back, that you would not just look at nature, but that you would look back to Mendel, right, or to other great geneticists, and have a sort of necessary gratitude to them, and the role that plays in your experience as a scientist.
Yeah, no, I think like what John Henry was talking about in terms of the artist looking back at the tradition, you can't do science properly without having gratitude to those that came before you, because it does frame for you what nature is, I think, right? So, and that's, I think the beauty of the scientific pursuit, that no matter how humanly we try to screw it up, nature doesn't change much, right? Now, and so there is this objective sort of thing to bring you back, and that's what the scientific tradition helps you to do. Now, there are the great breaks where you have sort of you reveal something new behind that. So you think of sort of an evolutionary worldview being a break where you have an insight into how nature works, or a quantum reality, which is a break from sort of Newtonian physics. But it's not as if Newtonian physics is wrong. It just has its place, right? And so without the understanding of what came before you and the gratitude for the data that's there, you can't do science in the way in as a productive way. Although you're not a slave to what came before as well, because recognizing the limits of a generation of scientists ago, their nature is a mystery that will never fully penetrate, right? And so there's always new things to discover. There's always going to be modifications and so forth. But you don't know what you need to modify if you don't know what people have thought and understood previously, right? And so, yeah, there is some modification, but you can't modify it the way Leshchenko did, because it's basically the same thing you're talking about with the opera, right? Yeah. It's no longer science, right? It's no longer...
It's a mockery.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe just one thing on this that I would add, because you make the interesting point that the relationship to the scientific tradition is not just one of pure reception. After all, science moves on. There are these threshold moments where something new comes along. And I think that one of the understandable, and this reminds me of Bill Tullius's question about gratitude and social reform. One of the reasons why gratitude can sometimes be difficult in the art world is because younger up-and-coming artists looking to find a voice of their own can feel somewhat circumscribed or caged by what came before, and so sometimes you do have sort of semi-violent kind of overthrow of what came before in music and in art. But it's always seemed to me that when you look at the great composers that have come in succession of each other, there's often a kind of intimidation of what came before. You know, I mean, everyone after Beethoven thought, how are we going to write, a symphony? I mean, Brahms suffered under this idea that he couldn't write a symphony worthy of Beethoven. But the difference, I think, in these cases is that there was a tremendous reverence for what came before and a willingness to be a kind of student, to be in a kind of state of tutelage, receiving what the masters before have offered, and then from there to break away. And that's a very different posture than just sort of arriving on the scene and saying, you know what, we're just done with all of this, and all of this. I mean, there's some pretty awful things that are written about what has come before, and to this day it can be very difficult. Christopher knows a lot more about the world of visual arts, but to be a tradition-minded painter today is not really a particularly good way to establish a successful career. I know you've told me it's coming back, and that's very hopeful, but it's still not where the mainstream is.
You can have a successful career in conceptual visual art in a way that you can't really in conceptual violin playing, right? You can have a conceptual composition, but a conceptual performance isn't really going to cut it, right? And that's, I mean, to your point, right? And you see with these technical things that you really have to learn, like you learn from a person, and you have gratitude for that person. With the stage director, you don't, right? You don't have to have a study under a master stage director. And you really do see this difference in arts that are handed on in this way versus those that are not. Another direction I had considered taking this talk, maybe another talk was on gratitude in the built environment and in architecture. This is another example where it's not, you can learn it in school, you don't have to have a master in the same sense. And with these young artists that feel like they need to do something new, right, to make their mark, you get all these just horrific buildings that have no gratitude for what's come before, for the traditions, for the built environment around them, right? Scruton writes wonderfully on this. Feel free to ask me about it. We can talk about it later. But that's, you see this difference, I think, in the arts. So,
thank you all for your thought-provoking comments. Dr. Haley, I have a question for you. I'm wondering if you could flesh out a little bit further gratitude and things that need not be so when it comes to justice. You could say that a person need not pay you back, but even when they do, it brings some kind of delight and you're grateful for it.
Right. You can be joyful for the justice, right? Especially if you don't expect to be treated justly. But you would be properly grateful for mercy, for charity, right? And so that distinction there between joy and gratitude, which accompany each other, right? They're not just here's one and here's the other, right? They're intermingled, like Schwartz says, applies also, I think, to mercy and to justice. You see this wonderfully articulated in Caritas and Veritate, where Benedict will say that, yes, on the one hand, we have said that mercy begins when justice is fulfilled, right? That you can only be merciful once you have been just. However, right, even that act of justice is still motivated by a love for the person and a recognition that I owe that person justice, right? So it's not just the case that you have justice and then mercy, joy and then gratitude, right? Like you do have this intermingling response. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that's an analogous experience, certainly.
We may look back on someone like Lysenko with some scorn at his silliness and the destructive results of his ideology, but he was only dealing with wheat and peas. Science today is denying human nature and denying that it's expressed as man and woman, so we've actually gotten worse.
No, without a doubt. And I think we're talking, there's a panel on transhumanism and transgender. I don't know if transgenderism is on that panel, but it's the same thing. It's denying the gift of what is human nature and what can science, get from that, rather than it is very similar to the attitude Lysenko had in terms of, this is my belief system, so I'm going to impute that on my science. And not only does it damage science, it damages the human person, right? And in much the same way, I think Lysenko had a greater human cost so far than what we see like with transhumanism, transgenderism. But transhumanism particularly is a rejection of the gift of the human person. No, human person is something that is deeply flawed and I need to fix, right? Rather than this is a gift that we should appreciate, right? I'm sure they'll talk more about that, I think, in a day or two.
I have a question from our online cohort. This question is for John Henry. So the question is, you presented the idea of lineage and tradition, which seems to be critical in developing a healthy sense of gratitude among artists. How can that idea be applied to art forms that are incredibly young and potentially still developing, such as film or animation?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and in part, I'm already inclined to say that what Christopher said about certain types of art and art forms and creation, like architecture, where it's possible to become very skilled. But there's either, in architecture, of course, there's a very long tradition, but it's possible to become skilled and to become employed as a marketplace for what you have to offer, whether it's particularly beautiful or not. But it seems to me that that inasmuch as something like animation has an expressive and depictive element, that there would perhaps be wisdom in the visual arts tradition that might come to bear on someone producing art of that kind. But it certainly is the case that it's easier to think about the art forms that have rich and established traditions because they show us what it looks like. It's harder to know what it looks like in these realms that are completely new. And of course, there are some questions about whether what kind of tradition develops in something unfolding so quickly too. I mean, the thing that you have with many of the great arts is that they unfold over millennia and centuries, and there's a lot of time for the organic aspect of artistic creation, which seems to be at risk of such acceleration in arts that make extensive use of technology. So it's perhaps not a satisfactory answer. I'm just not sure what it would look like. Do you have a thought on what a tradition related to something like animation would look like?
I really don't, other than say I think it's going to be very interesting to see. I mean, I do think in all of these newer arts, I mean, whenever I read or listen to these people, they do always have their influences, and you always certainly hear a lot of gratitude from them. Like, they don't ever seem like they're kind of self-sprung, But I don't know if they study with them or whatnot. So
it could very well be that there are real masters in any of these different fields to whom young people would go to learn and to be mentored, and I just don't quite have a sense. Another thing that is so different about the arts prior to the 20th and 21st century is its relative localism. I mean, you have these great artistic cities, like Vienna and Paris and Rome and Florence, and what happens in this hyper-connected world to the kind of traditions where you would move to go study under a mentor, and then maybe you'd become part of the school, the Siena school, the Florence school, and those aspects are not present in quite the same way in some of these newer traditions, some of these newer art forms.
I want to ask John Henry a question real quick, which some of you may know the pianist Friedrich Gulda. He was of the Viennese school, and he was a real first-rate pianist, but then came to America, got immersed in jazz, developed this really interesting style, went back to Vienna, where he was really not accepted because he no longer did things the right way in Vienna. He refused to wear the tuxedo and all of this. My question is, was Gulda ungrateful?
No, I don't think so.
It's a bit of a trap question.
Yeah. I mean, he had this extraordinary reverence for the musicians who
absolutely
played. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Hi. So this is a question for Christopher, if I'm allowed to call you by your first name. So when you talk about gratitude being something that's good for me, I'm reminded of just thinking about how first personal in character it is. And so that thought always prompts for me thoughts of Eleanor Stump's work on second person experiences and second person accounts. I wonder what you would think about taking an idea of like that sort of empathy and seeing the world through another person's shoes, and if there's a sort of sympathetic gratitude that you can have on behalf of another person. Maybe that reduces back to first person in some way, or it's a sort of putting myself in those other person's shoes, still myself on some level. But I wonder what you would think about perhaps being able to have a second person experience of gratitude.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, and I mean that makes perfectly good sense to me. I mean, if you think, I'm not as familiar with Stump's work as I am with Ada Stein, for instance, who writes a lot on sympathy and this lived experience with the other, and I think that's absolutely true. Like, I have, it's very easy to have gratitude if someone were to do a thing that's extra, that's good for my child. I will be grateful for that person, not because of the good that it was for me, but for her, right? And I don't think that's an abstract sort of, I'm glad that happened. I mean, I think you could really have a true act of gratitude for that, absolutely.
What do you think, Christopher, about the kind of witness of gratitude? It's always been very powerful to me, for me to be around people who have a heightened sense for some aspect of beauty. Maybe it's poetry, maybe it's music, but through their eyes, you sort of learn the practice of gratitude. You also learn how to perceive the kind of beauty that they're seeing. I always think of what my father and those who knew Dietrich von Hildebrand said, what it was like to experience music with him, for example. It was intensely interpersonal. He would grab your hand and he would have this very recollected posture, but he'd say, and he would turn to you and say, listen to this, do you hear this? And he was so intent on trying to sort of bring you in to his experience. I think Michael Healy would have had similar experiences with von Hildebrand. So it seems to me that there's a kind of sort of witness that we witness of not just gratitude, but in a way also gratitude that we can have from our masters and mentors.
Yeah, I absolutely think that's communicable. I mean, the act of gratitude, and that's sort of where I was going with the transition to Keats and the Endymion poem, that the poem is itself a reflection of an act of gratitude, but it becomes this thing that teaches us gratitude as well, right? It has its own instantiation, right? That reifies this personal experience of gratitude and then communicates it so that we can share. I didn't see the flower that Rilke saw, but I read the poem that he wrote about the flower, and I'm invited into that sort of experience. I don't need to go find that flower, right? Or any other flower for that matter. It helps, but it becomes this communal thing that we all have together. And this is, I think, where you really see the tradition of the arts and what the meaning is for many people personally of like a canon, right? It's not just some sort of collection of stuff that we've decided is good. It's the stuff that gives us this kind of response, right? That invites us into this shared recognition of the humanness at the heart of things, right? Like the creation, the communication of God through creation and beauty.
I think the same thing is true in the sciences, and even atheists like Dawkins, when they write about it, there's this deep love and beauty that they have towards creation. And I think that's part of a science. Your job as a mentor is to exemplify that to your students, and that helps, I think, offset the idea of nature as being just a tool to use, but rather it's something that you have a response to. That's Hopkins' poetry is the response to the scientific world in very much a real sense.
Thanks for the three talks. This is, I think, of the phenomenological maxim of back to things themselves from all three of your comments of, we don't let reality speak to us too much. We want to impose our ideas and meaning on it immediately. And I think we're so saturated in that. An example of this is in my own life. When I'm not listening to classical music, I, slum with pop and rock and jazz and things like that. And I will hear a song for years. And because those folks don't seem to enunciate very well, I later find out the lyrics are not what I've had in my mind and heart, and yet I prefer my own, and I decide I'm going to impose those lyrics on Bob Dylan's song,
Print
no
the
matter
legend.
what. And, you know, in my field as a teacher educator now, and I have a PhD in literature, and I taught high school literature for 1 million years. For decades now, the teaching methods in all levels, and I've seen this in public and private, is we want these kids to be meaning makers. You know, they generate their own meaning, and I just feel like John Paul Sartre's lurking in the background. You know, there's no human nature. You create your own essences, and nobody wants to let the stuff from the outside speak. And you've modeled how not to do that. How else can we do that? I feel like I'm fighting an uphill battle most of my career in this, where people students are taught to impose their own meaning on things and not be receptive to it at all.
We have an answer from the audience, I think. We have an answer from the audience?
What all of you guys were, something that was common theme in what all of you were saying. So I was reflecting on, is gratitude an act of creation? Because, and I think I've been mulling over this ever since the question of, can you have gratitude if you want to have social change? Because you have to appreciate the beauty of what objectively is true and is present in your field before you can ever make an innovation. So that's something I heard in what all of you were saying, whether it was about poetry or art or science. You have to appreciate and contemplate what's come before you so that you can build on the tradition and contribute something new. And if you don't, in a certain sense, in each of those fields, the contribution is an exclamation of gratitude or joy. Like I love to write poetry, so that's what I was resonating with. And it's the same as I'll contemplate something, I'll realize it, and then I have to say something about it because it's just beautiful. And so maybe that's what it means to help a child be a meaning maker. There's truth in there if we understand it rightly. Maybe it's the fact that the child has to see the beauty that is present and then make a meaningful statement about that. And if they don't make a statement, that's part of what it means to be a human co-creator, is to make a statement. It's such an honor to be able to do that. But if they don't see what's come before, they won't be able to make a meaningful statement that's consonant with truth and reality.
I think it's an excellent observation. And in the Hildebrand essay on gratitude, this is basically how he enunciates gratitude, right? Gratitude is a value response, and a value response is based in a perception of the value, but it is not just a kind of empty response. It's a meaningful, it has its own plenitude, right? So to thank is not just to say an empty word. And so Van Hildebrand, and Van Hildebrand sees it also in a kind of reciprocal gift structure, right? The gift that I receive, in a way I return that gift through my gratitude. And so I think this idea, I mean, I know what John is saying. There's a kind of, really corrosive sort of meaning creation idea where you are, it's all internally generated, right? There's no prior consideration of what's out there. There's no appreciation of that. And somehow in our world today, we have some of you might know Michael Miller from the Acton Institute, and he's one for wonderful expressions. And he always talks about the modern problem of imposing your boring subjectivity on the world, And it's his way of saying, we don't begin by being nurtured by what's out there, and particularly when we're talking about the world of values and artistic creation, but we sort of immediately start to kind of smear our subjectivity, over the external world. So I think that's anyways, it's a very astute observation, Catherine. And as to your question, I don't know if you have any thoughts for John about how you do it. I mean, I think part of it is modeling it. I think that as teachers, for example, when you can For example, there are a lot. I mean, often, you know, the art world, sometimes it speaks to people immediately. Sometimes it's a foreign language, and I'm sure that's true of literature because of the kind of patience that's required. And I think part of the work of the teacher today is not just sort of going directly into the analysis of the work. It's helping foster a perception in the first place, and maybe clearing away some obstacles. I think often the obstacles are more that of intimidation. You know, the art world is this very intimidating thing. I don't know anything about it. What am I even listening for? And so the mentor who clears away and I think sharing your appreciation, that creates this kind of resonance with the student.
Yeah, I mean that's all I got to. I mean, I don't know other than, I mean, the answer is it's a sort of accompaniment. I mean, it is this giving the response, right? If you don't give the response, you really haven't completed the act, right? You haven't really been grateful. And people will see, as you were saying earlier, they'll see that expression of gratitude, whether that expression is a poem or tears or whatever it may be, and that already is communicative. But in terms of sharing that with people, I mean, I do think it takes time. I mean, one of the things pro tip I give to people all the time, what I have often done, which I have found works really well, if someone is actually interested, is I'll take a piece of music, usually the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto, because it has very distinct opening lines, and I'll play, if I can get someone to sit with me for 15 minutes, you know, I'll play the first 5 minutes of 3 different recordings, and just ask them, like, what did you like about one or the other, right? And it's fascinating. People who don't know a thing about music know that they liked this one better. Well, why, right? And it turns out you do know something, right? It's the same thing with wine tasting. To tell people, like, the words are just made up. Just say what you feel, man. Like, it's just start talking about it, and you'll be able to describe it, right? And there's no prerequisite here. So.
All right. Well, we're grateful to all of our panelists, so let's give them one more thanks.